Is it possible to end AIDS as a public health threat by 2030? The United Nations thinks so, and the guests on this podcast series certainly hope so. But it's going to take effort, innovation, connections, and funding. Welcome to Can We End Epidemics, a podcast series by the global biopharmaceutical company ViiV Healthcare, in association with its majority shareholder GSK, and developed by FP Studios. I'm Henry Bonsu. Today, we look at what we'd like to call the promising science. Let's try and find out where it's taking us and what challenges may lie in its path. With us are Mitchell Warren, who's the Executive Director of the Global Health Advocacy Group, AVAC, and Dr. Kimberly Smith, who is Head of Research and Development at ViiV Healthcare. Welcome, Mitchell. Welcome, Dr. Kimberly.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Great
you.
to see you.
Kimberly, let's think about where we are now and contrast it with where we were some 40 or so years ago, when people first became aware of HIV and then AIDS. It was seen as a curse, a death sentence. Scientists didn't really know what they were dealing with. It was a virus that caused a collapse in the immune system. Now we know so much more. People are excited about pre-exposure prophylaxis. There's a whole range of tools. Can you contrast where we are today with where we were some 43 years ago?
Absolutely. I first became aware of AIDS when I was in high school. And in those early days, it was all horrible news of essentially young people acquiring this horrible virus and really in pretty rapid rate, disease progressing to AIDS and folks succumbing with a miserable experience. We first had antiretroviral therapies in the late 80s, but it was really into the late 90s that we got enough knowledge that we could combine antiretroviral therapies to be able to keep the virus in check and allow people to live with HIV. The challenge, though, then was that the numbers of medicines and the tolerability of the medicines was extremely challenging. People had to take a handful of pills multiple times a day. They often made them dizzy, sick to their stomach, and you had some individuals who felt like the treatment was worse than the disease. And so that was progress, but not enough progress. As we've moved into, the 2000s and now in the 2020s, treatment has progressed tremendously. We have multiple options for single tablet regimens that are available around the world. We have a major improvement in the availability of the best state-of-the-art antiretroviral therapies in low and middle income countries and resource limited settings. And so folks that are getting treatment in New York or Chicago or London, the same treatments are being given to individuals in Cape Town and Joburg and other parts of the world. So we have multiple single tablet regimens, and we now have long-acting treatment that allows people to not have to take a pill every day. So I think the progress that we've made in treatment and in prevention of HIV is enormous. But what continues to be a challenge, this is still a terribly stigmatized disease, and stigma impacts tremendously. It keeps people from getting tested. It keeps people from pursuing treatment. It keeps people from going on PrEP. It overall diminishes the lives of people who are living with HIV unquestionably. And so stigma is massive and is a major barrier to us getting to the end of the epidemic.
Kimberly, you've led me very nicely into my first question for Mitchell, because Mitchell, just as the science didn't know what it was dealing with back in 1981 and beyond, when it came to community, when it came to, Kimberly mentioned stigma, when it came to who was really vulnerable, targeted by this disease, people pointed the finger. They said it was a gay plague. That's certainly the view in Britain. We had tombstone advertising campaigns saying, "Don't die of ignorance." There was a feeling that if a person was gay, or indeed, a little bit later on, was from Africa or a drugs user, they were the only people you needed to be wary of. Hopefully, despite what Kimberly has said, things have changed significantly as a result of the kind of advocacy you've been doing. So please tell us where we were and where we are now.
Thank you so much, Henry. And we often say never confuse progress with success. There's clearly been great progress, but there's still so much more to do. And I think one of the recognitions many of us had at the beginning, and I think I might be a little bit older than Kimberly, thinking about the history of HIV, but we often said it was never just a virus. It's never just about the pathogen. It's about the people. And that's true whether we talk about HIV or more recently thinking about the last 4 years with COVID. We get so wrapped up in the virus and thinking about what it does in the human body that we forget that many pandemics, every pandemic, I would argue, really highlights what is and isn't working at a social level. And so you see HIV at the earliest days and still to this day, really shining a bright light on inequities, on human rights challenges, on people's behavior. Because at the end of the day, HIV is a disease that is transmitted through sex and through using drugs with needles. So we have sex and drugs, two very stigmatizing or potentially stigmatizing behaviors. And that's really why we need to make sure that the HIV response is never one that is just about the science. If we don't really understand people's lives and people's realities, then no matter how great the scientific advances are, we'll never be able to translate those into impact. And the way I think about this with treatment and with prevention is that great science of understanding the virus and how it infects is how we get to developing the biomedical options for both treatment and for prevention. But making those options available to people to protect themselves if they are needing antiretroviral therapy or protect themselves if they're not yet infected but at risk in terms of prevention, we have to translate those into choices. And that's where things get messy. That's where we talk about policies and politics and health systems and the interaction between an individual and his or her health provider and the interaction between the individual and their sexual partners. That's where things get messy, but it's also where things get exciting, where things get important in translating the biomedical options into choices that make a difference in their lives. And again, we've made some progress, but we've got a long, long way to go to really be successful.
Kimberly, let's talk about how we got to the range of treatment options we have today. People talk about PrEP, both pre-exposure and post-exposure prophylaxis, of course, the antiretroviral drugs that people are now familiar with. How did we get to this range of options that we have now? Because it might give us a sign as to how we need to do things in the future.
So, I think there was a period of time when there were multiple companies that were actively working on identifying new drugs. And if there's one thing that's a little bit concerning to me is the number of companies that are working in this space has diminished. And so it's almost like people think that we're done. We're far from done. But the big impact of community and advocacy cannot be understated. And so, when you think about some of the earlier access or compassionate use programs that exist nowadays, those came as a result of protests around HIV in the 1980s, where there was a demand for medicines to get to people faster. So having the community voice at the table when decisions were made about HIV policy, about how drugs get evaluated, about how we created compassionate use programs, about how we created access programs that created a safety net that made sure people were going to get access to HIV medicines despite their financial situation.
Mitchell, as a community champion who's been in this space since the late 80s all the way through to where we are now, Kimberly and her colleagues are working with very complicated biomedical science. You're representing people who are sometimes the most marginalized in Uganda, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Eastern Europe, in the southern states. How have you been able to mobilize them, get them to understand what is possible, and then translate that into meaningful pressure to both biopharma, to politicians, and in the end, to multilateral organizations?
That's a great question, Henry. And one of the things that we know very clearly in HIV, and it's true in other public health areas, is that it's never just about the science or just about the politics or just about the community demands. And it really is about where you see this massive Venn diagram of where all those interests intersect. And I am not a scientist, but I have had the great fortune to work at the intersection of science, policy, and activism. And every scientist really can be an advocate. And every advocate can actually build the literacy around science and research so that we can be equal partners in this endeavor. And when I think about some of the advances in clinical trial design, in the access programs that Kimberly described, it was when advocates learned about research and said, but why not this? Because oftentimes when you're not the expert, you might ask the right question to move us into a new direction. Every one of us thinks and acts based on what we know and experience in our own perceptions. So we might ask it differently, but it actually makes a researcher or a pharmaceutical company or a policymaker say, I hadn't thought of that. Let's work together and try that. When I think about PrEP particularly, when PrEP first was being studied now 25 years ago, AVAC was one of the first organizations to really look at PrEP. PrEP was actually code word for unethical research. It was dogged in controversy in the earliest days because people didn't understand why we'd even be looking at this idea of a pill a day to prevent HIV. And slowly but surely bringing advocates and researchers together to argue, to debate, and ultimately to co-create the research agenda is what did get us oral PrEP approved now almost 12 years ago. It got us a vaginal ring approved several years ago. Now, the challenge wasn't that, advocates can't develop the product, but they can push and prod and collaborate in unique ways. And that's why we have this robust pipeline. So today we think about PrEP in all of its diversity, all those different methods as one of the cornerstones of ending AIDS as a public health threat. And yet 20 plus years ago, it was code word for unethical research. That was all down to partnerships and researchers, companies, and advocates coming together, having the tough conversations, and aligning to a shared agenda.
Kimberly and Mitchell, you both sound quite upbeat despite the highs and the lows of the last 40 years. But cast your mind back some 4 years ago. We had this SARS COVID-19, or coronavirus as they came to know it. And the race was on for a vaccine. It was killing so many people. And within a year, we got one. And that's one of the reasons why people were so suspicious. They said, if we can get this within a year, why not HIV/AIDS? Ooh, what's going on? And it's really interesting to try and compare and contrast how long it's taken to make really meaningful progress with what we've seen in the last 4 years. Kimberly, what can you say to that?
Well, yeah, I think the reaction that folks have had to the rapidity of that vaccine is, really been challenging on a number of levels. One, the notion that this vaccine was made up out of a whole cloth when this virus was recognized is false. The reality is there have been years and years of research in mRNA vaccines, and a lot of that driven by HIV research. There was a tremendous amount of knowledge that then got to be put into place when you had a virus that actually was much more easy to target and one that didn't have nearly the amount of variability that HIV has. When we think about COVID-19, folks can name every variant, right?
Kimberly, I can even talk about the spike protein when I'm waiting for the bus with somebody random on the street and they know about the spike protein.
Exactly. But the fact that you know the names of the variants just tells you that variants are not common in comparison to HIV, which is literally thousands more variable than the COVID-19 virus. And so when you think of that challenge of being able to prevent it, imagine trying to prevent something that's constantly changing and that there's a tremendous amount of diversity in that virus across the world in comparison to one virus, starting out with really one virus that is going everywhere and is moving really fast and is super contagious, but it's one virus that you're focused on, as opposed to one that is so rapidly changing that you just can't keep up with the variation in it.
And yet, the wonder of the science, and again, I think Kimberly's exactly right. We would not have had a COVID vaccine as quickly as we did if it hadn't been for decades of investment in AIDS vaccines. Every HIV vaccine researcher, trial site advocate immediately expanded their work to focus on COVID. That's how we got it so fast. And yet, once provided, once made available, once approved, the uptake was not nearly what we wanted it to be, because it really actually harnessed, on the one hand, research literacy, so people knew about the spike protein. That we thought was a great step forward, that would change how we think about science, and yet it became politicized. And what we now know to see massive misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. And it really speaks to this issue that we touched on at the beginning. It's never just about the product. You can have the greatest COVID vaccine, you can have the greatest antiretroviral treatment, you can have the greatest PrEP product. But if people don't believe in the system, if they don't believe in their provider, if they don't believe in the researchers who developed it, then we can't translate the wonders of the science into people's lives. And that's why we have to work simultaneously at getting better products developed and making sure they get delivered in a way that meets people where they are and can overcome the challenges that we saw too often highlighted in the midst of COVID vaccine rollout. So our task is huge.
And Kimberly, I've been watching quite a number of individuals and HIV/AIDS activists on YouTube and elsewhere on social media. Sometimes they're excited about the possibility of a vaccine, a new trial. Sometimes they appear a bit hopeless. And just recently, I saw people getting very excited about an alleged fifth person cured of HIV after a stem cell transplant. And another news story about a scientist saying that one can actually cut HIV out of cells. Where are we with the science right now in terms of frontier thinking about how we may end AIDS, certainly as an epidemic? Where is the science taking us?
I think it's worth just stepping back and describing sort of some of the language that we use and making sure everybody's on the same page. When folks talk about ending the epidemic, they're thinking about it from a public health standpoint. So, reducing the number of new cases down to zero or as close to zero as we can get. And that's what we talk about when we talk about end the epidemic. But the other part of this is for the millions of people who are living with HIV, can we find a cure that actually takes the virus away from them, or that actually, allows individuals to control the virus without the need for any retroviral therapies for the rest of their lives? And so when we talk about getting to a cure or to HIV remission, and those are the terms that we're using, both cure and remission, there have been fits and starts. You'll see really exciting episodes like what started out with the Berlin patient, Timothy Brown, to the series of individuals who similarly were able to get an HIV cure after a pretty dramatic treatment effort that happened because they had HIV and cancer, that they received either bone marrow transplant or stem cell transplants. But that is such a massive and high risk intervention that it's certainly not something that you would start for someone who didn't have those malignancies. If you could live with HIV on medicine, then putting a person at risk for the terrible side effects of a bone marrow transplant or a stem cell transplant, you're only doing that because of the presence of that malignancy. That said, that did become somewhat of a roadmap that told you it was possible. And so I think, we see those cases as a proof of concept. And that comes to the point that you're making around some of the gene therapy efforts that are in place, where there's this notion that maybe you can edit genes in a way that makes people's CD4 cells become resistant to the attack of HIV. There is some really interesting research happening in that space, but it shouldn't be made to be a simple thing. Anytime you're trying to edit genes, that in itself is inherently associated with significant risk. And so, getting that balance right of how much risk you're willing to put forth for individuals to get to a cure is really one of the massive questions, I think, when we start talking about sort of gene therapy. Some of the other efforts towards what I would describe as more like HIV remission are attempting to boost the immune system in a way that it controls HIV. And we've seen some data that suggested some of the broadly neutralizing antibodies that can be given to individuals passively might help to reduce the latent HIV reservoir, and maybe reducing the reservoir over time can lead to HIV remission. Those are some of the questions that we're still trying to answer. And the good news is that there's a tremendous amount of effort that is being made, a lot of financial support going towards these efforts, lots of investigators around the world that are working towards HIV cure and remission. So I think that that's the good news, but I think we're still fairly far away from getting there.
And Mitchell, which out of the range of options that Kimberly has just outlined are you and those in the advocacy community most passionate about, most interested in, most enthusiastic about?
So I'd say all of the above, Henry, which is probably not the answer you most wanted. One of the things about where we are right now in the HIV/AIDS response, sitting here in 2024, the idea that we even talk about ending AIDS as a public health threat, even a decade ago, you would have looked at the two of us and said, boy, you two are magical thinkers. It ain't ever going to happen. And why are we even having the conversation? In the last 12 years, we have seen clear, terrific scientific evidence that U equals U, that if you are taking your antiretroviral therapy and you are virally suppressed, you won't transmit the virus. This U equals U. That's incredible. We've got PrEP in multiple forms and now additional forms coming. So you can protect yourselves in lots of different ways. So there's a lot of enthusiasm for what I think of as the delivery side. How do we deliver the treatment and prevention that we have at scale and with equity to make sure that we deliver the maximum impact? And yet, it doesn't diminish my enthusiasm, and I think it's safe to say community, civil society enthusiasm for ongoing research for additional PrEP options, for an HIV vaccine, and for a form of a cure or remission strategy, as Kimberly was just describing. I think where we are right now is we need to do our collective work as advocates, as researchers, as policymakers around what I think of as R&D&D. It's the research and development of the things we still need and the delivery of what we have with this scale and equity to get impact. We need to do both of those things at the same time. And so it's a complicated environment right now. And it's all happening in one of the most challenging moments economically and politically. When you think about the last 10, 20 years of the AIDS response, you saw PEPFAR in the United States and the Global Fund working with PEPFAR in many other countries around the world really bring more resources into HIV/AIDS than we ever imagined. And still robust research investments from companies, and particularly from the U.S. National Institutes of Health. That growth is not continuing. We are seeing flatlined and even declining resources. So this bold, ambitious, visionary agenda that we're both describing about delivering what we've got and developing what we still need, all is happening at a time when we have fewer dollars, pounds, euros, rands, shillings, you name your currency. And it's happening at a time when the political assaults have never been harder. When you look at what's happened recently in Uganda, in Ghana, in a number of southern states here in the US. So you have this perfect storm of incredible opportunity where we can even talk about ending the epidemic. And yet that progress is fragile. It could disappear tomorrow for lack of political commitment, for lack of resources, for too much complacency. So you've got this environment right now that I think is one of the most challenging because, 20 years ago, the science hadn't put us in such a positive place. And yet we still had all these disadvantages. Now we've got promises, opportunities, progress, and yet we've still got these enormous challenges. So we've really got to keep our eye on the prize, which is truly getting to the end. It's too easy to get complacent and turn our attention to other things. Our job is not done.
And Mitchell, looking forward then, what do you have in your mind's eye? Where is the focus for advocacy now?
Well, it's easy to start playing global health whack-a-mole. And I think we saw that particularly in the midst of COVID. One risk is that you take your eye off pathogen A and you move to pathogen B and A pops back up. The best example of that is the fight against malaria. 60 years ago, people thought we eradicated malaria in a number of places and they stopped the work that they were doing and they moved on to other things. And guess what? Malaria came roaring back. That's the challenge we have in front of us right now. We have to stay focused on the HIV response, but in the context of this larger global health architecture. And I think one of the things we are seeing coming out of COVID is a lot of conversation about where you can begin to think about an architecture that is more strategic, more collaborative, and particularly more person-centered. And if we follow the individual as opposed to following the pathogen, we might do a better job. Because then you say, oh, wow, that young woman also wants contraception. Oh, that man also has TB. Oh, that person's living in an endemic area for malaria. If we follow the person and build our programs and even our systems around that, I think we can be hugely successful. One of the things that I think we're challenged by is that in product development, you rightly design your product around the pathogen. You design an antiretroviral around HIV. You design a COVID vaccine around that spike protein. But you need to design your programs around the people that you're trying to serve. And if we do that more collaboratively across disease areas, what we'll find is that we can meet people where they are. We can meet multiple public health needs, and we can be more efficient with the limited resources that we all have at our disposal. Now, that's very aspirational. It may sound very naive on the one hand, but if we don't begin to design for that vision, I fear that we're going to continue to develop products that don't deliver. And, one of the polio vaccine developers once said, a safe and efficacious vaccine that sits on the shelf is neither safe nor efficacious. We are not doing this work, whether we're sitting at AVAC or ViiV or anywhere else, to develop products that sit on shelves. We're trying to develop products and programs that deliver public health impact. And if we reorient that as the focus, I actually do believe that it's not just Pollyanna, that can be a reality of the future.
Kimberly, Mitchell says there's no point having a fantastic product that just sits on the shelf. It has to get to people. They have to be aware of it. They have to know that it's within their reach, within their grasp. Can you speak to that, given where you sit at ViiV Healthcare?
Mitchell is exactly right. You can't make products that people don't want. And so I think it's really important that there's the community voice involved in the products that get developed, and that we spend energy on moving the needle forward, not creating new copies of the last thing. Probably the best example is in HIV prevention or PrEP, and finding ways to have multiple options for people to choose from that fit their lives. And so I think about contraception being the parallel. So, a woman who wants to receive contraception should have multiple options for doing that. She has a pill, she has a diaphragm, she has long-acting injectables. Having options means that you have something that meets the need of every person that's out there and who could benefit from. That issue of choice is so important. And I particularly think about it as it relates to women, because so much of HIV transmission in many parts of the world is an example of women being disempowered and not having the ability to control their own sexual freedom and their bodies and their autonomy. And so we have situations where women can't demand condom use from their partner, for example, because of the fear of domestic violence. Having options where women can control their ability to prevent HIV and not have to have their partner's consent for that is a critical piece. And I harken back to a conversation I had with a young woman who was a part of a big study that led to the approval of long-acting PrEP. Her words were incredible. She said it made her feel powerful. She felt worthy. It changed how she thought about herself to be able to be a part of that and to bring something like that to the world. She described herself as a rescuer, being a part of a study that brings something unique to her community. And so I'm really happy about the progress that we're making there, and that needs to be emphasized. Again, ways to empower women.
Tremendous. And Mitchell, what about ways to empower marginalized men, or to help the understanding of men who would repress women because they have to be educated, and some have to be empowered too, because the position of marginalized men, LGBTQI community in some countries is really terrible.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, again, whether it's a young woman in a peri-urban setting in South Africa, whether it's a young gay man in a different African country or in Europe or Latin America or anywhere, it really comes down to many of the same things, understanding the individual's lived experience. And that really requires us to work with communities to understand what they need and want to be able to overcome the challenges to prevention. We don't have a vaccine for complacency. We don't have a vaccine for misogyny. We don't have a vaccine for homophobia. And as hard as an HIV vaccine is, those are near impossible. But it does mean we have to understand that any of the programs we create, any of the biomedical products have to exist in that environment. And they have to understand, how do I bring people along? And, one of the challenges, of course, when we talk about empowering one group, the group that's typically oppressed them thinks that means they're going to be disempowered. And I think we have to change that dynamic. We've got to really show what we're trying to do here. We are trying to help people protect themselves. No one product meets everybody's needs everywhere all the time. It's a very dynamic space. You may use one product because you're in a certain kind of relationship, and then you break up and you're now having multiple partners. You might need a different kind of method, and it can work the reverse as well. That's why we've got to have this range of options so that people find something that works for them when they want it and when they need it. And we need to help people understand the things that they want and need. And so this is where it gets down to relationships and sexuality. It's never just about the product. Whether it's PrEP or treatment, it's never just about the product. It's about really finding a way in which that product can work in someone's life to give them what they want and need. And that may be protection, it may be empowerment, it may be sexual satisfaction and pleasure. All of these products need to work on that continuum of life experience.
Well, I must say that was a very rewarding discussion, and one filled with optimism too. Let me thank Mitchell Warren and Dr. Kimberly Smith. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Can We End Epidemics, a series of 6 episodes where we discuss disease prevention, health inequalities, the future of medicines, and health funding, among other issues. Do check out the glossary in our show notes for any terminology you might have missed. I'm Henry Bonsu, and until next time, thanks very much for listening.